Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan and I am very excited to have a special guest on my channel. I have Caleb from Caleb Likes Books. Hello, Caleb.
Hello.
So,
Thank you for having me.
oh, it's my pleasure. So our topic for today that we wanted to we talked about potential things we could talk about because Caleb, you do Star Wars book reviews, you do fantasy book reviews, you've done a little bit of horror, so you're expounding into new genres like I am as well. And so we were thinking about what were potential topics we could talk about, and we kicked a few around, and the one we decided was the High Republic to talk about it because you and I are both fans of it,
Yes.
but we also have critiques, so it's kind of a balanced nature. I have some friends who are like, absolute, they love every single thing about the High Republic and won't accept any criticism. And then I have another friend who hates the High Republic. Like, he read the book, wouldn't give it a chance, and now just condemns every single book that comes out. So you have two extremes. But here we're going to have a little balanced conversation. We have come up with some pros you came up with, some pros I came up with, some cons you came up with, and some cons I came up with. And we'll talk about them. And we may disagree on what makes a pro and what makes a con. There may be a little disagreement here, which might be fun. But I thought that'd be an interesting way, especially if you're a new reader, if you've not read the High Republic and you're like, should I or shouldn't I? Hopefully this video will help explain it and help make you understand whether it works for you. And if you have read the High Republic, you may be able to chime in the comment section and let us know. I agree with you, or oh man, you got this wrong. So on that note, would you like to talk about your first pro?
Sure. And just real quick, I'm not 100% caught up. I haven't read, what was it, Convergence, the
Right.
last one as of
Yeah.
now. But I've read the other adult and YA novels, and you have read more than I have. So
We've
if I
read
say
all of phase one.
yes, so okay. So my first one is the main thing that really drew me to the High Republic is that it's a really large scale multimedia project, which is something that I loved also in Legends with
Mhm.
things like the Clone Wars multimedia project and the various Old Republic things. Just this big era that crosses over, different forms of media, the comics, the books. Of course, I'm both of us are really only focusing on the novels, but like, it covers all these different things, and I think that's really great, and all that stuff.
Yeah, I agree. The way that they're able to do it in multiple media. So you have, for comics readers, there's something for comics readers. If you like adult novels, if you like YA, if you like middle grade. And I'm gonna throw in one of my pros in there, which is that it's for all ages. Because, and
Yes.
this kind of ties into this, that there are little like, a couple pages books for little kids. There's middle grade for, middle school students. There's young adults for high school students. There's adult books, and of course adults can enjoy the middle grade and vice versa if you're a good reader, I guess. But still, there's something for all ages, and then for all tastes. Like, if you're a comics person, you might enjoy the comics, but if you're a manga person, there's a 2 volume manga out. So there's a lot of those types of things that help different readers of all ages, which I think really helps the higher reach new readers. And one area I think that this is evidenced is the Utini. They had their big
Yes.
showdown recently where they were doing a lot of voting, and I was genuinely surprised that the top two were Light of the Jedi and The Rising Storm, which are the two adult novels. But I was impressed by that because it shows that this is bringing in so many readers. For years, if you ask people like their top Star Wars novels, you think the winners would have been the original Thrawn trilogy and maybe an Old Republic novel or the Revenge of the Sith novelization, which all did very well.
Yeah.
But the fact that the top two was the High Republic versus High Republic shows it's working in the discourse because it's bringing people of all ages in. So
Yeah.
I will
I was
agree to that.
surprised about that as well.
What's your next pro?
So the next one I have is the villains are very unique. You have like in phase one at least, kind of the main three groups that I think of are the Nile, the Drengir, and the Nameless.
Hmm.
Of course, not the Drengir, the Nile are kind of the big novel villains, but then they also have the Nameless as well, and the Drengir come in and into the dark. And they're all very unique from one another. And they're very unique, I think, for Star Wars in general, because when it comes to villains in a lot of the stories, you get like a lot of Sith or characters affiliated with the Sith. You get bounty hunters, that kind of thing. You don't really get like the kind of pirates as much.
Yeah.
The kind of, kind of the Nile, and then the Drengir are this weird plant alien thing that I don't know a lot about because they're only in one of the novels, unfortunately. But then you also have the Nameless, which I don't know if anybody else gets this feel from them, but they kind of give me a very like cosmic horror type of feel to them. This kind of, especially in the Fallen Star, I really got that feeling from them, and so I really like that. And they're all just very unique, and they bring something really, really new to Star Wars, really in general. So
That is a good point. That there is a difference between the various types of villains, but there's also like a specificity to them. Like you have, the Nile, you have the Eye of the Nile,
mm,
Martian Row, and then you also have the Lorna D, and you have, other specific members of it that you
yeah,
can remember. And those two in particular really stand out to me. And then you have the Drengir and stuff, but that's one of the things that the Legends line also benefited from is you would have in the Legacy of the Force, there is a singular big bad who's very distinct, and then you might have something like the New Jedi Order, which had a general fear of the Yuuzhan Vong, and then
yeah.
it had specific Yuuzhan Vong or even specific other villains in the series. So that I do agree that the villains are distinct at least. Um, my
Even
next,
like
yeah,
oh, sorry. I was
no,
just
go
going
ahead.
to mention in Path of Deceit. Um, I don't know if the Path of the Open Hand would. I don't know if you would consider them villains based on that
Oh,
book. Maybe I would say probably yeah. It's bet I can't remember super duper well that book for some reason, but like even them, like even though they clearly are kind of the thing that came before the Nile, even they
right.
are very unique in a lot of ways, even though they are kind of connected to them.
Oh, yeah, they're definitely
There,
villains.
yes,
And you
that is
also
one
you also
faction.
need to read the other books.
Yes, that is one faction that I'm really looking forward to seeing more of once I get around to catching up.
So they are a little bit in Convergence, but they are also really in the Battle of Jeddah. They're
Okay.
really central in the Battle of Jeddah. So they're well worth the read. Um, uh, my next uh my next pro that I'm going to mention is the idea that this is a an entry point for people. So
Yes.
one thing that was, I will say, a little bit difficult about Legends is that they had big interconnected series like this, but they didn't always have easy entry points. Like for instance, you're at the moment reading the New Jedi Order books,
Yes.
but those weren't like the first books of Legends that you started with. And would you recommend people just start with New Jedi Order?
No.
No,
I
right.
I think if you really wanted to, and you were aware of things, maybe, but even then, I wouldn't recommend it.
Exactly. That's something that requires, as even though it's its own unique series, it requires so much understanding and backstory and convolution. And that's not even getting to the Legacy of the Force and the Fate of the Jedi, which were also very convoluted. And you had to have the New Jedi Order read really in order to understand those. So one thing that I think the High Republic does is that it's a great entry point. You can start phase one having never read a Star Wars book, and it's an excellent, entry point. And to be honest, you can start phase two just because I've read, some of the phase two books. You could start phase two as an entry point and then read phase one after that. That's why I think it's kind of like you could watch the prequel trilogy and then watch the original trilogy, or you can watch the original trilogy and go back to the prequels. Like you can do it, they kind of flip flop in which order you have to do. Same thing with this. So that's actually I think, a really brilliant design for this. And so I do applaud them for making an entry point, because, as I said, it brings in a lot of new readers. There's a lot of people who were not talking about Star Wars books and are talking about them now. So
Yeah.
that's
That even kind of happened with me because I didn't really read much in college, and towards the end of college, I was starting a new job where I had a lot of downtime, and so I picked up Light of the Jedi because it was the cool new thing that was just coming out, and like that was my entry point into the canon in
Mhm.
general as far as the books, and even like reading overall, that's kind of what started it. But like, yeah, that was a good, like, it's a new era, it's something fresh and exciting, but like it's also easy to kind of get into and all that stuff. So
So why don't we go to your next pro?
okay. Um, so my next one is that I really like that it is a lot of different authors. It's something that some of the Legends series did too, like New Jedi Order and Legacy of the Force and everything, where it brings in a lot of different voices, and a lot of different people who have interesting ideas that can all kind of bounce off each other. And with the canon, at least as far as I'm aware, most of the time, if you have like a trilogy or like a series of books in some way, it's all one author, like with the Thrawn books, for example, or things like that. Whereas this kind of brings in a lot of different people, and even like phase two is bringing in new authors, so it's not just the same group of people all throughout.
Yeah.
And I really like that about it as well, which is not so much about the High Republic itself, but it's something that I really appreciate about it, as a like a larger thing.
I'm going to hold off on that because that's actually one of my cons.
Uh-oh.
So I'm going to wait to talk about that till we get to cons. So
Okay.
my next pro is this one. I think is interesting that it is set in an era that is both familiar and separated from what we know. So here's where it's familiar. The planets we know. When they say Coruscant and you spend time on Coruscant, you're like, yeah, you know where that is. You know where the Jedi Temple is, and it's the same temple.
Mm,
When they're talking about families like the Santekas, when they show up, you know who the Santekas are. And
yeah.
then you have characters. Yoda is in this.
Yeah.
And so it's he's not really a mage character. He's in the comics a little bit. But
Yeah.
Yoda's present. So that's able to, you have the familiarity to it, but it's not so familiar that the entire book feels like it's hitting you over the head with familiarity, and you still have that freshness. One of the things that made the Old Republic novels really good was this freshness to them. It felt like you were exploring something new, something not necessarily related to the movies. And so this is able to get best of both worlds and get it's kind of like that old rhyme: something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue.
Yeah.
And the books are blue now. So it fits the rhyme. So
Yes. Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
I do appreciate that. Do you have another pro for us?
I guess the only other one that I have would be the characters. I love the characters in the High Republic. I consider them some of the best characters that we've gotten.
Okay.
Um, I don't know if you agree with that or not, but I love a lot of the characters. Like Elzar Mann is like the top three canon characters for me. A lot of the YA characters I really like. So, and I'm also like a big, like when I'm reading a book, I will take good characters over a good plot. I tend to be more of a character focused reader anyway, so that is kind of a big thing for me. So,
Yeah. There are some characters that I think are very memorable. I think that Elzar Mann, I think that Avar Chris, I think
mhm.
that and of course I said they're memorable, but now I'm all of a sudden not remembering their names. Why am I not remembering the green girl, the really young
Oh,
Jedi?
that's true.
Yes, Sylvestra. Sylvestra Rowe. It's like I do remember it. It's just, brain fart. Yes, Sylvestra Rowe, great character, really really invested in her. So there are some characters that really stand out, but if you don't have any more pros and I don't have any more pros, I'm gonna go to my cons. And I believe I have more cons than you do, so
Yeah, I
I
only with a hand.
apologize. Um, uh, my con is that sometimes the characters aren't well enough defined. And so this is a problem that I think the books had, particularly phase one. I think phase two is better at this, but particularly phase one and particularly Light of the Jedi. One of my problems with Light of the Jedi, even though I love it, it's one of my favorite novels. I do admit that it throws so much at you,
Yeah,
and it's hard to distinguish the characters, and they don't have enough of a unique voice. They don't have enough uniqueness to them, especially since so many of them are Jedi. Sometimes when other book series work, it's because you have a Jedi here and a smuggler and a politician. Like, you're able to have big differences, but when there's so many Jedi involved, it can be really hard to distinguish, especially when so many teen characters have the same teen traits, because they're trying to connect with teens. So I get it, but I do think that's a negative, because I think that some characters will absolutely latch onto, and then the minor characters especially will be forgotten in the long term. Whereas something like New Jedi Order, I think the minor characters stick around because they did a good job of establishing them well. Maybe that's just me. Do you agree or disagree?
I kind of agree with that a little bit. I do think I think the characters that do stick me with me really stick with me. So maybe
Mhm.
that's where I'm getting it from. But I do agree, like Light of the Jedi, it does have a lot of characters in it, and I feel like Light of the Jedi, at least for me, is the weakest out of the first three books in
Ooh,
terms of characters.
okay. Oh, in
Um,
terms of characters, okay.
yeah, and also in general, it's honestly, but it's still really good. But I do think like the characters for me weren't as memorable as they were in like Rising Storm, Fallen Star. Even like I said, the YA books, I actually think the characters are the highlight for those. But yeah, so I can kind of see what you're saying, I guess.
So, what is your first con?
So my first one is one that I kind of referenced earlier with the villains, the Drengir not being in the novels in
Hmm.
phase one. So in phase one, of course, they did Light of the Jedi and then Into the Dark within like a month of each other. And when I read those, I figured, okay, the Nile are going to be the villains for the adult novels, and then the Drengir are going to be the villains for the young adult novels. And I was excited for that because then you would have, these two lines of novels that would, overlap maybe with a couple characters, and they might reference events from each other, but otherwise, like they would have their own main characters, their own villains, which they do have for the most part their own main characters and their own villains. But it's in the other two phase one YA books, it was just more Nile, and I really would have liked to see more Drinkier in there. So
Yeah. And I do know
because
that they show up in the comics a little bit,
yes,
and in the manga a little bit, but I agree. And that actually leads into my second con. Man, it's like we planned this. So my
I guess
second con is that the novels got too convoluted at times. So the pitch that you mentioned should have worked is the adult novels should have followed this specific characters and this specific plot line group of plot lines, and then maybe you reference the young adult and middle grade and the comics and stuff, but overall you're following the same characters, same plot lines. And
yeah,
then the YA should have had its own thing, and then middle grade should have had its own thing.
yeah,
That's what it should have been, but instead it became well, this adult novel focuses on this, and then that plot line is picked up in this YA novel, and then
yeah,
that YA novel is picked up in one of the comics and things like that. And so they kind of blend. So if you're really exciting, oh man, this is such a cool plot line, you're like, wait a second, where to go? Unless you're reading everything, you might get lost in that. And that's a bit of a struggle. For instance, one of my friends was reading the adult novels only, and he was so excited to read about I think is it Mari Santeka, the woman with some of the force powers, we'll say.
yeah.
um yeah
I think
uh yeah, you know who I'm talking about. her storyline is not she's in the first two adult novels, but her story is not resolved in the adult novels. And that was a real, it was resolved somewhere else, and I won't spoil where it's resolved in or how. But I was so frustrated, and he was frustrated because he just didn't know. He was like, where'd it go? Did they just forget about her?
Yeah.
So that is a problem that I think ties in, that they should have had one line. For instance, with middle grade, the middle grade should have just been Vernestra Rowe. That's what it should have been. The YA should have just been I am blanking on his name, the protagonist of Into the Dark.
I'm forgetting it too, which is sad because he's one of my favorites.
Right, right. I have the book right here. I can picture him perfectly, but Reith
Yeah.
Silas.
Yes, that's
Sorry, Reith Silas. So he should have been the YA character, and then the adult novels should have had the bigger cast. And I think that would have been like Lone Great Storm and Avar Chris and all that stuff. So that should have been the adults. So that was a clear delineation. That's not what happened. So,
yeah.
and I'm going to take a second real quick and go to one of my other cons before you go to your next, because it ties into this con, which
Okay.
is that sometimes to me, and this, you mentioned this as a positive. You mentioned that having the different type of authors, the variety of authors was really helpful. I think it was actually a little bit harmful because authors tend to like their own stuff that they created, and they tend to want to incorporate it a lot into their works. It happens in all media tie-in fiction, and it happens in Star Wars quite a bit. If Zahn can use Thrawn, Zahn's going to use Thrawn. If Michael Stackpole could use Corran Horn, he was using Corran Horn. That's what happens. So when they
That
had
happened
so many varied,
that happened to me recently because I just read Dark Saber, and because
Kevin
what's
J.
his name?
Anderson.
Kevin J. Anderson, because he did Jedi Academy. All of the Jedi Academy characters were in Dark
Yep.
Saber, just out
Yep.
of nowhere. So,
Exactly.
which was
Exactly.
great because I love those characters, but it was a little weird. So,
Exactly. So that happens, and this happened in other things in the EU as well. For example, you haven't gotten there yet, but in the Legacy of the Force, there's an overarching story that you're following. But it was like, imagine you have three trilogies. Book one of each trilogy was Aaron Alston,
yeah,
and he typically followed the main characters. And then book two in each trilogy was written by Karen Traviss. So you just take a hard turn into the Mandalorian stuff, and you're like, what, where'd this come from? And then in book three, it was Troy Denning, and Troy Denning loves the Young Jedi Knights characters by Kevin and Rebecca Mesta, so he would take a hard turn into that. So each time it was like you were going to a different series almost. And that's what this kind of feels like. Whenever Justina Ireland's writing, just about, you always have Sylvestra Rowe. And whenever you have Daniel Jose Older writing, he has the main characters from his comics. And then whenever you have Claudia Gray writing, you have Geode. Like
yes,
that type of thing happens. I think that Cavan Scott's better about this because he writes for more variety. But this is still a problem that they've had, is that it feels like each author's focusing on their own thing. And because they all jumped around, one author would do adult, one then middle grade, then young adult, they did jump around like that. The characters jumped around with them. And so it became hard to follow if you were liking a character or liking a thing like that. So anyway, that's my long, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
I think yeah, I would kind of I don't think it's so a huge detriment for me, but definitely is something that I noticed. It was on one hand it was kind of nice because it was like, oh, I get to see all these different characters that otherwise I might not be able to because I haven't
Mhm.
read the other stuff. But at the same time, it's like I was reading uh Fallen Star, and there are characters from Claudia Gray's other stuff that just kind of show up, which was nice for me because I had read that other stuff. But
Mhm.
for people, just like you said, just like your friend, just reading the adult novels, that'll just, and the things that happen with those characters, it won't carry the same weight, or anything like that. Like them being there won't be as, you know, it'll just be like, oh, there's some new characters that are kind of interesting rather than, oh my goodness, it's Geode again or whatever.
Right.
So,
So
and same sort of thing with like the other ones as well. So
what is your next con that you have?
Yes. So this is also one that I kind of referenced a little bit earlier, which this is my only other con. So you're free to go off on your own thing with this, but I have that. I talked about how I tend to be more of a character reader than a plot reader, but in the YA books, in phase one, and even in well, I guess it was kind of the opposite in Path of Deceit, actually, for me. I found the characters really compelling in the YA in phase one, and I found the plots entirely forgettable. I could not tell you a single thing that really happens in like 80% of those books.
Right.
So, and like I said, it was kind of the opposite a little bit with Path to Deceit, which is kind of funny. But in
Mm-hmm.
phase one, like I didn't really resonate with the plots all that much at all, especially Out of the Shadows. For me was kind of a dud in terms of plot. Like I liked the characters, and that was basically it. Kind of the same with Midnight Horizon as well. Um, but yeah, that kind of disappointed me. Whereas I feel like the adult novels, again, I did really like the characters, but I felt like the plots were also fairly strong in those. Like I can actually remember what happened in those books pretty well, even though it's been relatively the same amount of time since I've read them as the YA books.
I 100% agree with you. And I'll say this is a problem that Star Wars has, not just with the High Republic novels for the YA, but also for just in general. If there's a Star Wars YA novel, I think the plot is generally not as good as the adult
Hmm.
novels. Whereas there's a lot of character work. Um, there's a lot of character work uh in the YA stuff and not as much in the adults. So
Yeah.
uh yeah, I agree with that. I think that again, I've mentioned this several times. Phase two seems to be fixing a lot of the problems phase one had. And as we're recording this, we are right before the release of tomorrow, two new phase
Mhm.
two novels come out. So I reserve judgment to change my mind if they all go to heck in the next one. But I still think the general idea stands that they're fixing the problems, which is good for the future.
That's
Um,
kind of just what I've heard as well, so that's good to hear. So,
so this next one, um, uh, I'll mention really quickly. The release dates sometimes make it very difficult to know where to recommend people start. Like generally, we know start with Light of the Jedi, start with Into the Dark, start with like the A Test of Courage, the first phase one books. But it's if people are like, no, I want to know what order to read them in. It's really hard to be like, this is the order. Because there
yeah,
are different websites that have said, here's the High Republic reading order. And I'm like, great. And then I look at the other one and it's slightly different. I look at another one, it's slightly different. It's kind of like when you keep putting something in Google Translate and the reading it's eventually when you get back to the original, it's just totally different. That's what like the
yeah.
reading order thing is. So yeah, I think that can be a little bit confusing. Do you like if you talk to people about High Republic, do you have that same problem?
Um, I haven't really talked to people who have had that problem, but I have seen it discussed online, like on Twitter and things, people asking, I want to read all of the novels and the comics and everything, or even just the novels or whatever. And what order should I read them in? And they'll get like five different answers.
Yeah.
So it definitely can be a difficult thing. For me, it's not so difficult because I just read the adult and YA, so it's like read
Right.
the adult, the YA, then the adult. So, but for if you're looking into more than that, then yeah, definitely that can be an issue.
So I'm going to my last one. I'm going to touch on very briefly because I don't like delving into this subject, which is politics. Um, uh, and you can totally, if you don't want to comment, you don't have to. But one of the things about the EU that was great was they dealt with some political themes and tended to be from a certain side of the political aisle, but it felt very natural to the story. It felt very like the themes worked very well and it felt like it was a natural outpouring of it. And I mean, even George Lucas, when he made the Star Wars movies, there's some very interesting political themes in his movies as well. But in
Before
the
the
High
switch.
Republic, there are some times where it seems like it's not just a political theme, but the worldview of the author is very overt, and that's the word I would use, overt. And so if you're from that political view, that's great. but I know there are a lot of readers who are turned off because it's so overt that it's very hard for them to get into it. And so we talked about how much this is expanding Star Wars for people. Well, when you do this, it kind of lessens it. And the idea for, if you're trying to write a book series like this, you want it to be what's called 4-quadrant, which means you are approaching every single potential person that can read it. And they have that by having books for kids, books for adults, and whatnot. But then when you make your political themes so specific, they tend to tick off part of a fan base. And those people, even if it just happens a little bit in a few books, they tend to write off a whole series. So I know people who just refuse to read any of the rest of the books because of that reason. And I feel bad because I'm enjoying the book so much, but I understand why they're mad. So that's why I think that can be, it can be a helpful if in some ways, but overall I would call that a con.
Yeah, I have seen that come up with some other people for sure. Like some people talking about certain aspects of that and just kind of turns them off. And like generally in any case where something similar to that happens, it kind of is unfortunate because it's like, this is a really cool thing, and because of certain elements, whatever it may be, really in general, and it just turns them off. It's just kind of unfortunate. So, yeah.
Neither of us is going to get canceled for this conversation. Whew. All right. We're both safe. And that's why live streams, well, side note, live streams are so difficult because I'm like, please don't say anything that's going to get me canceled. Please don't say anything. Be very careful with what I say on live streams. So that's all of my cons and all of my pros. Do you have a quick, like, this is what you would pitch to someone? Like, if you're like, if you like this High Republic's for you. Do you have a quick pitch like that?
That is a very good question because I have a very broad one,
Yeah.
and it's like if you like Legends and the the big stuff of Legends, but a little maybe I wouldn't even say more character driven because Legends can be pretty character driven
Yeah.
sometimes, but like, if that's something that appeals to somebody, then I see people who are big EU fans who, love the EU and they're kind of fine with just sticking to that. And it makes me kind of sad because I'm like, the High Republic to me feels the most Legends-esque out of basically everything that Disney has done with Star Wars so far. So I would say if you enjoy those kinds of big scope, very interconnected storyline aspects of Legends, which is something that I really enjoy about it, then I think that you should give it a shot. So
Good. Yeah, I would say if you're a fan of the Jedi as a whole, you'll
yes,
enjoy this. If you like interconnected stories, you'll enjoy this. And if you enjoy like the ability to read one and dones while at the same time reading big scope. Like some of these novels, like Race to Crash Point Tower, really easy one and done. But at the same time, it's part of an overarching story. So it has both elements that I really like. So
yeah.
yeah. Well, can you tell everyone, Caleb, a little bit real quick, like 30-second pitch about your YouTube channel, and then tell everyone where to find you on socials if they want to follow you.
Sure. So I have a YouTube called Caleb Likes Books because my name's Caleb and I like books. Pretty self-explanatory, I
Great
think.
branding. That's
Yes,
works so well.
absolutely. I was trying to come up with a name and I was like, that works. So I kind of cover similar stuff to what you do, the fantasy Star Wars books. I also am a little bit into sci-fi, but not super heavily at the moment, and a little bit of horror as well. And I'm planning to get into some more media tie-in fiction, but I haven't done. I've read a couple Assassin's Creed books, and I have an Indiana Jones book, but I'm going to be hopefully doing more with that. But right now, it's mainly Star Wars and fantasy. So yeah, if you're into that, then check out my channel and stuff. And you can find me on YouTube and Twitter and Instagram at Caleb Likes Books. It's the same thing for all of them. I post my text reviews, my written reviews on Instagram, and then my Twitter, I just kind of generally talk about stuff and all of that. So yeah,
All right. And yes, thank you again for coming on. This was a blast to record.
thank you for having me.
And as always, please like the video, subscribe to the channel. Please comment on your own High Republic pros and cons. Would love to have those debates there. And I'll link to some of your stuff in the description of the video. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.